Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Icarus, and we are doing Lipping Girl again. Actually, chapters 11 and 12, because it turns out chapter 11 is like a page long. And usual disclaimers, I am talking about a book that was written in 2005, published in 2007. Some of the terminology is outdated by today's standards, and I am trying to come into this as unbiased as possible. I do have a bias because it's been used against me so many times, and I've read the first 10 chapters, but I still attempt to call out when I am having a gut feeling versus when something is actually factually bullshit. And as usual, I've got my notes on my laptop, so let me just scroll up to chapter 11, which is called Deconstructive Surgery. And I made some notes, so I'll read those first. This chapter is, once again, mercifully, mostly about herself, though she does ascribe universal truths to individuals that rub me the wrong way. I don't feel like I can properly comment on them, though, because I do have a drop or two of penis envy. I want a cock. But I don't think it's fair to say that the world assumes everyone wants one. It's very Eurocentric, and even in my conservative as hell church, it wasn't true. Sure, it was because just talking about sex and genitalia was more or less forbidden, but my ace experience of wondering what exactly my youth pastor is packing was pretty lackluster in the whole dick department. Then I just add words. Words mean things. Do my words mean things? This is one of those moments where I don't disagree with her sentiment, but her attitude in the chapter is really revealing of how this book is treated and where this attitude in modernity against trans men and cis men and non-binary people comes from. So this chapter is about bottom surgery, just as a heads up. And I made a note of that in chapter 10 that it felt that I felt like it was going to come back up, and it does immediately. So Apollo has hit me with the red ball of divination. So I wrote, she writes, and I highlight it, and those who patrol the gates of women-only spaces are often dead set on discriminating against me, driven by the ridiculous belief that my girly little estrogenized penis is somehow still pulsating with hypermasculine energy. So, just highlighted that to show this is the attitude she's coming into with this. This is the attitude throughout most of the book. It's very caustic, and in some ways it's understanding why she's so caustic. But then she weaponized this anger towards other people that don't deserve it. She continues on. On the other hand, having the operation has its own stigma attached to it. No medical methodology induces as much fear and anxiety as SRS, sex reassignment surgery. A friend told me he once saw SRS on the video Faces of Death, sandwiched between real-life shark attacks and murder attempts. Some people go so far as to call SRS a form of self-mutilation, conveniently ignoring the fact that more common procedures such as nose jobs and liposuction similarly involve the removal of a small amount of non-essential tissue. So here's the thing. I'm actually about to have top surgery, which is gender-affirming surgery or sex reassignment surgery. I am very scared. Part of this is because I've been wanting to do this for 9 years, and it's finally coming true unless something happens tomorrow with my blood work or something happens at the hospital, but it's a new OR, and I'm not sick, and my blood work shouldn't be out of normal, so yeah, tomorrow I'm getting blood work done, and Thursday I'm going to have surgery, which is a jump ahead of when I thought I would have it in August. So I've been spending the past few days in a terrified, anxious, not able to focus on my writing state because, I'm scared. It's a major surgery. My mom is being supportive, but even she's like, this is big. And I've talked about my mom in the past, and it's big. It's not really reversible in the way that some other procedures are, and it's just like I'm a little resentful reading this chapter today in the mindset that I am, and I realize I'm in a particular mindset, and I may not have thought of this way before, but reading this mindset in my current thing. Also, the the comparisons to plastic surgery, liposuction, nose jobs, that sort of thing, does make sense. A lot of people consider them non-essential. However, there are essential health and medical reasons why someone may have a nose job or liposuction. And in addition, it does change the shape of your body in some way. So these are very good comparisons in many ways. However, I don't think the way that Serrano is comparing them as being like non-essential tissue dealio is necessarily apt, because there are a lot of people that fear, dislike, hate these quote-unquote cosmetic procedures, while there are people who get these quote-unquote cosmetic procedures that they are life-affirming. They help them move past issues that were keeping them mentally hostage, in much the same way that my boobs do to me, or Serrano's dick. So this was written in 2007. She didn't have bottom surgery at the time. I don't know if she has or has not. I don't really care. It doesn't influence my reading of her work. So I can understand, but in this chapter being like a page and a half long, it feels like she could have gone more into this and the stigma and fear, and how it actually can be relatable to stigma and fear of affirming surgeries that a lot of people don't consider to be medically necessary, that cis people have. And the whole dichotomy between trans surgeries and plastic surgery, when in many cases I feel like they kind of overlap, in the sense that we are changing our bodies to feel better about ourselves and or becoming mentally and physically more healthy. The next thing I highlight is just a little down. So it's no wonder that most people assume that I must be mentally ill, because in this culture, wanting to be a woman is something most people find literally unimaginable. And this is just going back into the whole sexism and the struggle, that the idea that the world is phallocentric, meaning that it's more obsessed with penises, and women are the absence of things. And it's just showing a very white-centric point of view, you know? Because this is very much a Western ideology that has pervaded into other cultures, but this is still something that I see mostly centered around Western civilization. And there's a lot of talks about how this isn't universal, but she's making it universal with her work and with her previous discussions of third genders and other cultures. But that's it for chapter 11. Let's get into the meat of it now, which is chapter 12, titled Bending Over Backwards, Traditional Sexism and Trans Women Exclusion Policies. I will read my summary at the end, because it's less of a summary and more of a I am angry with this and how she handles this, which can be most of my video reactions. So it starts with a quote: "Prejudice usually can't survive close contact with the people who are supposed to be so despicable, which is why the propagandists for hate always preach separation." So to start with, she talks about how she spends a lot of time working on trans women inclusion in lesbian and women-only spaces. And she read a lot of anti-trans women discrimination. But I'm highlighting this particular sentence because this is a problem with her writing, besides the caustic stuff that she is embedding throughout. That's really bad for my fucking ADHD brain. This is one sentence. These included derogatory anti-trans women remarks by influential feminist thinkers such as Mary Daly, Germaine Greer, Andrea Dworkin, Robin Morgan, and of course Janice Raymond, who, in addition to writing the anti-trans screed, The Transsexual Empire, tried to convince the National Center for Healthcare Technology to deny transsexuals their right to hormones and surgery. Semicolon. Stories about transsexual witch hunts in which committed lesbian feminists like Sandy Stone and Beth Elliott were publicly outed, debased, and exiled from the lesbian community solely for being transsexual, semicolon, and of course, trans woman exclusion policies, such as the Michigan Women's Music Festival's euphemistically named Women Born Women Only policy, which was retroactively instated in the early 1990s after an incident in which a woman named Nancy Burkholder was expelled from the festival when it was discovered that she was trans. That's an entire fucking sentence. And of course, we're getting back into the Women's Music Festival because she's not had enough of that. Understandably so in some ways, because she was involved in movements against it and talks against the Women's Music Festival. But we've gone over it once. I've talked about before how I think the people that the Women's Festival attract, and this is women spelled with a Y instead of an A, but the festival attracts people that you don't necessarily want to be around anyway. There is her talking about how her experience after she transitioned was how in her day-to-day life she dealt with stuff, and she started facing more stigma for being a lesbian than she did for being a trans woman. And then there's stuff about, she began to write not only about being trans, but about experiencing the world as a woman and a dyke, had a feminist bent, and I wrote, it seems like your work has spawned a severe hatred of trans men and the trans community. But then, right under that note, I highlighted like 2 paragraphs. I'm going to read a little bit at a time. Unfortunately, many people tend to artificially separate feminism from transgender activism as if they are distinct issues that are in no way related. However, I have found that much of the anti-trans discrimination that trans women come across is clearly rooted in traditional sexism. So, yeah, this is how she gets the trans misogyny thing. And I also need to reiterate from previous chapters that Serrano has straight up said that her transition, once she started transitioning hormonally and surgically and all of that stuff, she started being seen as a woman within months. Whereas other trans women will never pass, and same with trans men. There are some trans men that can and do pass, and then there's other trans men that don't. So a lot of her view of transphobia and transmisogyny and misogyny is filtered through this lens of someone who started passing and being seen as a woman in the general public very shortly after she transitioned. She didn't have much of a middle phase, and you see this is how her viewpoint gets rooted, as well as when she talks about subconscious sex and non-binary identities only being a partial expression of it, and her beliefs that trans men can medically transition much more easily than trans women. So the very next sentence is, this can be seen in how the media powers that be systemically sensationalize, sexualize, and ridicule trans women while allowing trans men to remain largely invisible. Because being invisible is a privilege. And I'm not coming up with that whole cloth out of what she's saying, though I absolutely can. Later in this chapter, she says that trans men have male privilege. Straight up, no nuance, no context, no moderating language around it. Just trans men have male privilege. And we will get to that. But really what gets me is this sentence about trans men getting to remain invisible is junctioned right next to, it's why the tranny sex and porn industries catering to straight identified men do not fetishize folks on the FTM spectrum for their XX chromosomes or their socialization as girls. No, they objectify trans women because our bodies and our persons are female. So, she is putting in this paragraph, this was the entire, well, probably not the entire paragraph, but I had to break it up so that I could actually read it. But in this paragraph, she is saying trans men are invisible, and that's why they're not in porn. Trans men are invisible, and they're not exploited by porn. Okay, before I read my notes that I wrote when I was reading this initially, I need to say, you can have a group that is hyper invisible to the point where people don't realize trans men exist. That the only type of transitioning is male to female. That is a legitimate viewpoint that I grew up with, that only trans women existed, that trans men were trans women, and there's nothing else. I didn't know what transgender meant. I only knew of the stereotypes that you could see in movies and stuff. So you can say that you have a group that is hyper invisible to the point that many people don't realize they exist, including people who are in that group or would be if they knew. And you can also say that another part of the same group is hyper visible, and they can both be suffering in equal amounts in different ways. Saying trans women are hyper visible and it sucks for them does not mean that trans men's hyper invisibility is a privilege. Just because one group is hyper visible, hyper sexualized, hyper scrutinized does not mean that we go and look at the other half of the coin and say they are privileged for not being visible. That's not how this works. I need you guys to understand that you can have the same collection of people and half of them get hyper visible, half of them are hyper invisible, and it's still bad. It's not a privilege on either side. Okay? And trying to compare it to the porn industry, which has its own plethora of problems, and using porn as an example of how trans men have privilege over trans women because of sexism is bullshit. Okay? This pissed me off, if it's not obvious. I'm going to go back to my notes. So in addition to that, I also have issue with the straight identified, and she uses this a couple of times in this chapter. I don't remember if she's used it in previous chapters, but I'm clocking onto it now, and okay, putting this aside again. We have a problem in the queer community of when we see people being shitty, we decide to question their gender or sexuality. Most notably, I saw this with the J.K. Rowling transphobic manifesto, where she admits that if she had been exposed to non-binary and transgender identities as a child, she may have at the time identified as trans or non-binary instead of as a woman as she does today. And a lot of people took that and are like, oh, look, she's non-binary, she just hates herself, sort of deal. And it's like, she is a woman. Rowling identifies as a woman. She has never said any differently. You don't get to make that assumption for her. And my spouse has told me about how Will Wood, who is a singer, has been extremely cavalier about his gender identity, that sort of thing. And people have tried to insist that Will Wood is a trans woman because of that. And of course, the great old adage of the homophobe is actually a super closeted gay, and he hates himself, and that's why he's homophobic. Yes, in very select few individual cases, this may be true, but by deciding someone's gender or sexuality for someone else, you are basically doing the same thing that the people who are phobic and are trying to keep the laws in that keep us as second class citizens at best. You are doing the same thing that they're doing to us. It's not okay. This is Icarus's soapbox. Stop saying shit that presumes someone else's gender or sexuality. Take what they say. Don't use language that undermines it. There's plenty of other reasons for shitty people to be shitty. They don't have to be closeted and hating themselves in a certain way to be doing this. Okay? Okay, Dory? So the next paragraph that I have highlighted, which is immediately after. I have found that many female-assigned genderqueers and FTM spectrum trans people go on and on about the gender binary system, as if trans people are only ever discriminated against for breaking gender norms. That might be how it seems when the gender transgression in question is an expression of masculinity, but as someone on the MTF spectrum, I am not dismissed for merely failing to live up to binary gender norms, but for expressing my own femaleness and femininity. And personally, I don't feel like I'm the victim of transphobia as much as I am the victim of trans misogyny. And I write, how did you get worse? Serrano, what the actual fuck? As if trans men, masculine people, don't get discriminated against for not being manly enough. Also, there are AMAB trans people who still fall into masculine modes, but that doesn't make them less non-binary. Transmisogyny is a specific type of transphobia. You are still a victim of transphobia. So once again, she is basically saying, trans men have male privilege. They don't have to jump through the hoops to get their medical care. They don't have to experience gender binary based oppression because they're men. Meanwhile, me, Miss Julia Serrano, I am being assaulted on all sides because I am someone who was born a man, but I am actually a woman, and therefore I am the most oppressed sex. And everything I'm going to write into this book is going to demonize anyone who doesn't agree with me, especially trans men, especially binary trans men who were born female or identified as female at birth. Because when I say trans men and I say trans women, I only mean AFAB and AMAP people. I don't give a fuck about non-binary folks. I don't give a fuck about people who may go outside the norms of their own transition. I don't care about intersex people. When I'm railing against people, it is me, a middle-class, college-educated white woman, against every other single binary gendered person in the world. Next part I highlight is that much of what is commonly called transphobia is merely traditional sexism in disguise. And this is right after the victim of transmisogyny statement. So then I write, wait a second, so this is essentially claiming that transmisogyny is not a specific form of misogyny directed towards trans women. Like, isn't that supposed to be inextricably linked? That's why trans androphobes hate the idea of trans men having a term that's a specific form of phobia for someone being both trans and male. They claim we're flipping the coin or copying transmisogyny, and beyond the fact that it's linguistically stupid to deride a word for being a copy of another, if this is what transmisogyny is supposed to be, a total separation from transphobia, then it's just, and then I just go, oh my god, I hate this doesn't make sense. Also, the assumption that trans men don't face traditional sexism. We do, especially if we're non-passing or not stealth or get outed, and that's only misogyny. Don't forget that the patriarchy also hurts men. Only a very specific type of neurotypical, physically abled, cisgender, straight type of man is accepted. You step outside of these very narrow boundaries, and you are hit just as hard as a woman for not being a traditional man. Now, if you have a gay man and a cis straight woman, and they're both white, sure, maybe the gay man has a little more mobility than the woman, but then you're just splitting hairs. And the entire point of feminism that Serrano is purportedly part of, intersectional feminism, is supposed to be looking at the nuances and seeing how different points of oppression build on top of each other, not turn into a game of who's the most oppressed person in the world. Because let me tell you, Serrano, you will not win that game. You live in the US. You have financial stability. The people that will be winning do not have access to your work. Yeah, thanks, Dory. Alright, moving on down. Not very far. And she starts talking about how she would do spoken word performances at queer women's events. And she's like, while I was welcomed very warmly by most of the women who attended these events, I would sometimes come across certain women who would act dismissively toward me, who seemed bothered by me being there, who acted as if they were granting me a special favor by tolerating my presence, who would make offhand and inappropriate comments about my trans status as if to remind me that I was not a real woman like they were. Whew. Her sentences are fucking mouthful. This sense of ownership and entitlement about being a woman or being lesbian seemed hypocritical to me. After all, as soon as we would walk out the door, all of us would face similar discrimination for being women and for being dykes. And I want to pause right there and just point out that she said most women welcomed her. And it was a minority of women who did not and were outspoken about it. And that, I feel like, is important because if you, again, I need to reiterate, this was published in 2007. The world is inchworming its way towards more and more acceptance of other people, if societally, if not politically. Thank you, Supreme Court, for being fucking... So, in general, there's been an upwards trend in more and more protected rights for people of color, for women, for queer people, and that is good. The fact that in the 90s and early aughts, she faced this sort of thing sucks. Yes, it does. But it is telling to me that at least it was a minority as opposed to certain spaces like the Women's Music Festival she likes to rail on about so much. But all my good faith that I want to give her, because this shit is terrible and it sucks and it should not be tolerated. Like, take all of that I said and add in the fact that, sure, things are getting better, but the only way it can get better is if we don't tolerate this in our spaces. And so the people that were condemning her for being in a woman's only space should have been kicked out, essentially. If they weren't, that's a problem. See, I can understand nuance, unlike fucking Serrano, because she says, but what was most frustrating about the way that many of these women dismissed me was the fact they seemed to have no problems at all with female-bodied folks expressing masculinity and with trans people on the FTM spectrum attending their events. In other words, they didn't have much of a problem with transgender people per se, just so long as they were male or masculine identified rather than female or feminine identified. And I didn't even notice at first. She writes about the fact that these women didn't have problem with female-bodied people being gender non-conforming and expressing masculinity. And she's talking about dykes. Okay? I'm sorry, I am a dyke. I was called a dyke in high school. That is a word that I can use to describe myself. Dykes are traditionally seen as gender nonconforming women. There are he, him lesbians out there that aren't trans women or trans men. They are just lesbians who identify as women who go by he, him pronouns. And there's nothing wrong with that. But she lumps in trans men with gender nonconforming women because the gender nonconforming women are expressing masculinity. And to her, apparently, that's just as bad. I didn't even notice that until I was reading this out loud, that she was not just... Jesus Christ, okay. I wrote some notes. While I never attended these sort of meetings in the time period Serrano is referencing, as I am but a wee babe and I was 14 when this book was published, this is another clear signal of resentment towards trans men. First off, we're not given details about what's happening here. Clearly, this isn't a turf space, as Serrano has been allowed here, as opposed to the Women's Festival of Michigan. There are not a lot of safe spaces for men in general in the U.S. There are like homeless shelters. There are lots of women's only spaces for women's and domestic violence, and that makes sense that women only spaces like that exist. But men only spaces are few and far in between. Men only spaces in feminist circles are even fewer and far in betweener. So, in a lot of ways, and this is going to be a thing where, I'm going to put that aside again. This is going to be another moment where we can have two equal but different sounding facts. So, if you are a trans man and you do not pass, or you are at danger of being assaulted because you are trans, where should you go? If you go to a men's shelter and you don't pass, there's a very good chance you're going to be rejected. Or if you are accepted, there is a good chance that you may be assaulted. I mean, women's only spaces, women can be assaulted by other women. It stands to reason that the group that is statistically most likely to be assaulted might be assaulted if they're not seen as a man in a space filled with men. Like, this feels weird for me to be saying it out loud, but women's only spaces exist to protect women. And if you end up being a man who does not look like a man in a man's only space, not saying it would happen, I'm saying it's just, there's a reason why women's only spaces exist. So, a trans man or a non-binary masculine person may find better safety in a space that doesn't have cisgender men in it. Simple as that. There's two more points. The second point would be these women-only spaces, these lesbian and dyke spaces. There are plenty of men, not myself, though I was insulted constantly in high school as being a dyke, even though I portrayed myself as being straight. Go figure. Trans men, just like Serrano did in reverse, can go through a series where they identify as lesbians and identify as dykes, and then come to the realization that no, they are transgender. And shockingly, when you have developed friendships within a certain community and you are part of this community, you may not want to separate from it or get rid of those labels entirely, because they are a part of yourself and they are a part of your friend group. And shock and awe, maybe not everyone in the friend group wants to dismiss the person because they got their first shot of testosterone last week. So there is another reason why trans men may be in lesbian slash dyke communities. And the third reason, and this sounds at odds, but we also need to remember that there is a very real tendency to degender trans men. We talk a lot in Serrano's work of degendering trans women, and she is willfully ignoring the fact, and this comes up explicitly later, that trans men will be seen by women as just dysfunctional women or failed women or still a woman, and they're being allowed in those spaces, whether they want to be allowed or not, is just a further degendering of trans men. Now, I gave two positive examples of why trans men and trans masculine people may opt to exist in what are arguably women-only communities. Safety, community. These two good points do not go at odds with the fact that these spaces can be very degendering. I want you guys to understand that. Just because there are good reasons does not mean there's also not bad reasons. It's not always all three at once, but sometimes it can be. And that really depends on the group. I hope that makes sense. Again, chapter 12 is Icarus's soapbox chapter, apparently. Because that's all I'm doing. Alright, going on to the next one. This privileging of trans men over trans women is not merely a bias held by certain individuals, but rather one that is often institutionalized within queer women's culture and organizations. These days, it is not uncommon to see the word trans used to welcome trans men, but not trans women, on everything from lesbian events to sex surveys in play parties. And I'm just going to leave that. That's immediately after the whole, the diatribe I just got off on. That's not me scrolling down. That's within the same paragraph. And she brings up the Michigan Women's Festival again. I'm not going to read the quote because it's basically the whole Michigan Women's Festival is allowing trans men into the space, but not trans women, even though I identify as a 100% female. And I'm just like, why do you want to be included in an event that ignores people's actual identity in favor of their genitalia? Because, like, why does that matter? I know she has railed against Buck Angel in the past, recent past, not this past, because he is horrible. Buck Angel is a horrible representation of trans people, just like Blair White. And I go on and I talk about, like, the easiest way to choke out phobic people is by creating inclusive spaces and having them be inclusive. That will draw people who don't necessarily agree with the Women's Festival over to them, but they didn't have another space to express themselves. Also, a continuation of these movements degender trans men in the same way that they are degendering you by reducing you to your birth certificate. They are reducing trans men to their birth certificate, and I don't know why. I do not know why a trans man would want to go to the Women's Festival, which is, by nowadays standards, if nothing else, a transphobic place to be. And there's so many better options. I do not know why they would want to do that. But there are scummy trans people, just like there are scummy cis people. And I realize a lot of her railing against the Women's Festival is because she's part of Camp Trans. It comes up later in this chapter. Camp Trans is or Trans Camp or something like that, is a answer to the Women's Festival. Basically what I just said, making a radically inclusive space to counteract a radically exclusionist space. But give me some more examples, please. Moving on. This is a little bit down. While anti-trans women sentiments are generally expressed outside of my view, I still hear about them all the time from my trans male and queer female friends who often tell me about self-identified dykes in their community who openly discuss lusting after tranny boys and trans men one minute, then in the next deride trans women for being creepy and effeminate. So one of the issues I have is, so she has trans male friends who have probably come to her and been like, hey, this dyke has been fucking wanting to come after me even though I'm a dude. And she decides to include these communications as if it's a privilege for her trans male friends to get hit on and be called tranny boys. And they're being fetishized by lesbians. And her only focus is, why do they want to fuck the trans guys, but they don't want to fuck me? That's it. That's what this sentence is. That is what this sentence is. It's, why do they want to fuck the dudes, but not me? I'm a lesbian. Why do they not want to fuck me? Why do they want to fuck the dudes? And the answer is, they're being fucking transphobic. They're being trans misogynistic to you. They're being trans anthrophobic. Actually, no. They're being transphobic to you because they don't see you as a woman. They're being trans anthrophobic to the trans men because they are expressly denying their identity as a man to fetishize them. The very next sentence is, the popular spin given to this preferential treatment of trans men over trans women states that trans men have been raised female and therefore should have a place in women's and lesbian communities, whereas trans women have experienced male privilege and remain physically male on some level, and therefore should be excluded. I do like the fact that she goes from raised as women to male privilege. So I'm going to just read what I wrote because I feel like it makes more sense than anything I could say off the bat. Objectively, I can see where she's coming from. It's not universal that all trans people were raised in their birth gender, and everyone's experience with being raised a certain way and transition is unique. So it's not a good blanket statement. It should be left to the individual to discern how their upbringing has influenced their thoughts. Sort of like TMA versus TMA. TME versus TMA. But, you know. I am, however, starting to hit a brick wall here that I've been hitting throughout the book. I've been trying to address this as transmasculine or transfeminine without taking birth sex into account and to be inclusive of non-binary intersex folks. But Serrano does not. There are AMAB and AFAB, trans women, trans men. There are no such thing as an AFAB trans woman or vice versa in her book. And it's clear when she says trans men, she's only talking about AFAB trans people in general. Which is really fucking weird, okay? I realized this book was published in 2007, and we've come to a greater understanding of gender fluidity and identity since then, but Serrano talks about how gender identity and non-binary identity is a partial expression of one's subconscious sex, meaning you're only partially displaying your true internal sex. And she's ascribing male privilege to people who, as she states, were once seen as women. And then I noticed there's a however coming up. I'm clenching every muscle in my body. However, she says, this argument makes little sense when examined more closely. After all, how can someone who identifies as female and currently lives as a woman have less in common with a woman than a male-identified person who has male physical attributes and currently benefits from male privilege? And I just had Joseph Joestar in my head going, oh my god, because I've been watching that recently. I just finished the fourth part. The problem with this book, right here, it's right here, super condensed. Serrano is using her experiences, feelings, and beliefs and using them to ascribe blanket statements to an intensely varied amount of experiences and folks. She did it with the Mohawk Nation and other marginalized third gender lives, and she does it with her experiences in medical gatekeeping. She talks about John Money, who helped edit and publish the first transgender-based medical textbook. John Money is a piece of shit, even if he has done good. I've talked about the boy who was raised a girl, David Raymer. John Money published that medical textbook in 1969. David Raymer was brought to him in 1967. There is something to be said about that. About the fact that he took a little boy who had been forcibly reassigned female and traumatized this little boy and his twin brother and made it seem like everything was a success and caused forcible sex surgeries on intersex babies. And eventually David Raymer was able to come out and be like, no, this was horrible. All of this shit was horrible. And then he died. He and his brother committed suicide because of John Money. There's a conversation to be had there. I don't think she cares about it, though. Because she says here that she puts in here a way that it could be seen that, no, I'm talking about cis men. But no, she puts male-identified person who has male physical attributes and currently benefits from male privilege. If you identify as a man, according to her, you have male privilege. And that's why we see this belief to this day. Because people will read this. They will ignore the tiny bit of nuance that she's trying to interject into this by pointing out male physical attributes and currently benefits from male privilege and be like, she's talking about trans men. And then she says this. So clearly trans men have male privilege. And that may not have been her original point. But if it wasn't something that she wanted to mention, she would have said cisgender men or cis-sexual men. But she didn't. Jumping down, I believe that this preference for trans men over trans women simply reflects the society-wide inclination to view masculinity as being strong and natural and femininity as being weak and artificial. Which is bullshit. The reason that trans men are being more accepted into these spaces, we've gone over a couple of instances, but the biggest one, in this particular case that we're talking about right here, is because trans men aren't being seen as men. The Women's Festival does not see them as men. They see them as men liked or women. It's transandrophobia, Serrano. You are upset that you are not being accepted while trans men are being degendered, misgendered, and turned into nothing more than their birth certificate and their genitalia. That's what's happening right here. And this is why this book and this chapter pisses me off so much. Like, I could go through the rest. I could tell you how she talks about Camp Trans and how there's no suspicion or hatred of trans men, but there's plenty of trans women. Or these people who hate trans women believe that they're trying to protect their values. The whole penis argument about phallic power again. The idea that we weigh male visual cues more than female ones, and the inclusion of a penis is the most important, even though, you know, when you are looking at a person, unless they're actually naked from the waist down, you're not seeing what junk they have. You can make assumptions, sure, but, like, you can't see that they have a cock. You can't even see if I'm wearing pants right now. How do you know? I'm not. But it's because it's fucking hot. But if I didn't say that, you wouldn't know that. Actually, you still wouldn't know that because, for all you know, I'm lying. I'm just copying Markiplier in the early 2016 or early 2016. I could talk about how she complains about it can't be just physical attributes, or the fact that the social constructionist ideology is being used to excuse the fact that female to male spectrum folks are allowed into women's only spaces. Again, just trying to, again, degendering trans men, but let's ignore that. I could tell you a lot of random shit, and how she talks about how these trans women exclusionist laws and rules are favoring trans men over women, and ignoring again how it affects trans men. I could tell you all of that, but I'm going to sum it up with my summary. This entire chapter pisses me off. Serrano could talk about the issues she's talking about without talking about trans men at all. She could talk about these issues and note briefly that AFAB people are included regardless of their gender identity. She could talk about these issues and mention the hypocrisy and how damaging it can be to insist that trans men are included because it reduces us to nothing but our parts. She could even be more nuanced and talk about how this highlights the problem there not being safe spaces for feminist men to exist. So many trans men find safety in women-only spaces or have a history of being a lesbian and dyke, and shocking, are not excised from the moment they've taken their first shot of tea. But for fuck's sake, don't blame trans men for existing and being fetishized and used by people who don't see them as men. There are absolutely shitty trans men that feed into this. Again, Buck Angel, he's a piece of fucking shit. He should not have a platform, but he does. But the absolute blind assumption that trans men have male privilege as a blanket statement is shocking. You'd think Serrano, of all people, who talks extensively about her own perception of how people are treated when she started changing in her transition, that she would notice this. She absolutely had access to male privilege, and she can and does talk in brief about how it changed over time, and she lost access to it. But does she actually focus in on it at all? No, she focuses only on how people see her now, how much worse she's been treated as a woman, etc. And of course, she rails against the idea of socially constructed gender. I'm so angry with this chapter because it literally should just be titled, "Let's throw trans men under the bus. Let's blame trans men for how they're treated. Let's blame trans men for still residing in communities that they resided in their entire life and make it their fault that they didn't have maybe the access or the self-introspection at the time to realize at a young age that they were trans masculine people and not consider themselves a lesbian or a dyke. Even though she, for a very long time, went through a series of events to reach the fact that she is a trans woman and a lesbian. Yeah, what's good for the goose is apparently not good for the gander. And that's why this chapter pisses me off so much. So, yeah, I'm actually angry that this chapter exists and that this is the book that has been tossed at me time and time again to try and explain why trans men don't face transandrophobia and why trans men have privilege over trans women and why trans women are the most oppressed class. And this book is so full of bullshit. It does not care about trans men. She does not care about non-binary people. She does not care about intersex people. She has a binary in her brain. She is bitter by how she's been treated, and I do not blame her for being bitter, but I blame her for making this book and letting it become as big as it is without any corrections, without any introspection, without learning from other people's experiences and later incorporating them into her talks. She is on the side of using TME versus TMA language. And she does not denounce the idea of using them as self-identification static labels. Julia Serrano, if I ever meet you face to face, I am going to slap you. And not because you are a trans woman, not because you used to be a man, but because you wrote this transandrophobic, exor-sexist bullshit, and you have sparked trans-inclusive radical feminists. You have sparked Badals. You have sparked a huge hatred of men, and I've allowed the Radfem Kool-Aid to enter intersectional spaces and have led to young cis boys to hate their own bodies because they thought when they hit puberty they are going to turn into monsters. That's going to be it for me today, guys. Feel free to follow for more. I'm going to be recording my whole surgery journey and be posting it at some point. I'm going to be making videos when I'm still healing. So, yeah. Let me know I'm not alone in this bullshit. Let me know if you got to the end in my fucking diatribe. I'm so fucking mad right now. I'll see you next time.